we could start. Yes, I see that John has started recording. So welcome everyone. This is a roundtable organized by King's Decolonizing Working Group. I see Aggie, who just appeared on the screen, who is one of our academic facilitators. So it's a network of students and staff that have been working on activities of curriculum decolonization and broader about the decolonization of our universities and the contemporary Marxism working group. The idea of this panel came from a reflection on the Eurocentric and somehow urban-centric nature of many debates on alternatives to COVID-19. And even if research, like, for example, we are very glad to have here Rob Wallace this evening. And his research has shown that contemporary agribusiness has become an incubator of pathogens. And therefore, there is a problem related to the nature of agriculture in capitalist society. But despite this, we believe that there has been very little debate on the importance to link up urban struggles and peasant and indigenous struggles against extractivism, industrial agriculture, and dispossession. And even though it's widely believed that, it's clear that the pandemic has a global nature and somehow is intensifying probably the hegemonic shift from the United States to China, we also believe that there has been very little debate on how we can learn from the non-Western world when we reflect about alternatives here in Europe and in the United States. And so we're very glad, as I said, to have here Rob Wallace, who is an evolutionary biologist with the Agroecology and Rural Economics Research Corp, and the founder of Pandemic Research for the People. He's the author of several books, including more recently Dead Epidemiologists on the Origins of COVID-19. I believe that Rob posted the link to his book if you're interested in buying a copy. And he's also written another book that probably many of you know, Big Farms Make Big Flu. Our second speaker will be Professor Lin Chun from the London School of Economics, who is on the executive committee of China Quarterly and the editorial committee of a Socialist Register. And she's also the author of several books, including Reflections on China's Reform Trajectory and China and Global Capitalism. And she's in Boston at the moment. And she told me I think she recently finished her new book, which will be out next year, on revolution and counter-revolution in China. And the last or penultimate speaker will be Hamza Hamshin, who is a London-based Algerian researcher and activist and the coordinator of the program on North Africa for the Transnational Institute. He's a founding member of Algeria Solidarity Campaign and Environmental Justice North Africa. And he has written several books and also reports on extractivism and anti-extractivist struggles and ecological struggles in North Africa, including the struggle for energy democracy in the Maghreb and the coming revolution to North Africa. And he recently contributed to a region in revolt, mapping the recent uprisings in North Africa and West Asia. And Baba Ai will also join us after the panel and tell us a few words about the End SARS protest and movement in Nigeria. So I think this is a very exciting panel this evening. So thanks everyone for being here. The speakers will speak for about 15 minutes each, and I will let you know when you have 2 minutes left, if that's all right. And then we'll start our debate. Okay, so please, Rob, do you want to start?
Sure. Hello, everybody. Well, I would say good morning, but over there it's good evening. And unfortunately, the way things are going, not so much as good. just to get us up to speed, we're about it's 60 million confirmed COVID cases worldwide. It may be as many as 10 times of that. We're at 1.4 million confirmed deaths worldwide, and on surprise to everybody, perhaps, we're at 12.6 million cases here in the United States and rising. So we're entering our winter wave here, and there's nobody at the wheel. We've got 9.2 million in India, 6 million in Brazil, 2.2 million in France, 2.1 million in Russia, 1.6 million in Spain, 1.5 million in the UK. So, it's a really turned everything on its head in terms of what the global north thought would be the outcome of any outbreak. It would be the global south where the virus would emerge, and it would be the global south that would suffer the worst consequences. That may still be the case, but as of now, it's remarkable the extent to which many countries of the global north have, I would say, be unprepared, but the word "be" has this connotation of a kind of passive nature of, somehow the virus got out underneath our defenses. But I think it's very clear what we see here is the outcome of 40 years of neoliberalism in many countries. Before we get into that, I just want to continue to finish up this kind of global tour, because while the global north, many countries there are suffering the worst of outcomes, and frankly, entirely of their own blame, to be blunt. And I speak about the governments and the, to use the term, the old term, the bourgeoisie, but in addition, and not necessarily the people involved. So, day-to-day people are suffering the worst consequences of some considerably poor decision-making that it rises not just out of personas like Trump, but out of kind of the structural outcomes of decisions and processes that have been going on, if not hundreds of years, and certainly since World War II. But to continue to take the tour here, other countries have been doing quite well. China, the country of origin from which the virus emerged, and we'll get to that notion, we'll return to that in due course. But on absolute geography terms, in terms of GPS coordinates, the virus emerged there, but though being unprepared at the beginning, in part also because of its imperial projections, it also was not ready for the damage that it brought about. But it certainly pivoted quite quickly and controlled an outbreak in short order. You've got the sending 40,000 workers to Hubei, 40,000 healthcare workers to Hubei, the province of origin, really speaks to, building a hospital 10 days. These are all the earmarks of a country that is taking this seriously, compared here in the US, where it's still, frankly, something of a freak show. The incapacity of a country to govern itself. Who would imagine at the beginning of the year we'd be looking at the United States as, with all the earmarks of a failing nation state? How far the mighty have fallen. Of course, though, that's leaving a trail of bodies behind. So it's even as we might reject the imperium, when empires rise, it's tough on everybody. When empires fall, it's tough on everybody. So I'm not sure it's really a place to click our heels about. In fact, I know many people have died, and it's a terrible thing. But to take the tour and go around, you have Vietnam right up against China, comparatively a poor country, doing quite well. Taiwan, also near China, doing well. Of course, New Zealand, Australia, Iceland. There are countries around the world who took the notion of governance seriously. Wow, what a concept, the notion that having a government involves governance and actually taking care of the population that you ostensibly represent in whatever form that might be. All these countries show that it's not necessarily merely about GDP, it's a matter of the focus of where money goes and what it's applied to. And so we have, a whole series of non-pharmaceutical interventions that, without a vaccine in sight, was able to basically bring down their outbreaks in 2 to 4 months' time. So it really just speaks to, here in the U.S., we're so focused on the U.S. There's, not only to our incapacity to speak other languages, but in invading country after country, it's remarkable when the media will, in essence, ask people here in the U.S. to identify the country we just invaded on a global map, and most people can't do that. So, but any of us here who actually will, bring their eye to seeing what's going on around the world can see that, in fact, COVID is most definitely a difficult problem, but it's something that can be handled if the government and the population and whatever power behind the throne, as it were, is willing and able to actually engage the problem and not pretend that it doesn't exist. In the US, the public health system has been smashed. I mean, even the concept of public health has been smashed by neoliberalism. Basically either divested or sold off what we would consider the major arms of public health. Health has been basically brought down to a consumer commodity to be bought at the point of sale with your doctor. So even under Obamacare, you have 28 million people who are uninsured, 44 million people who are underinsured, and this does not bear well for any pathogens. Don't really get the business plan. They weren't informed of insurance companies and hospital corporations of their quarterly profits that they were supposed to rake in. The COVID doesn't care about that. So we didn't get the virus we can make money off. We got the virus that has its own agency and is spreading by virtue of its own agenda, as it were, if I may anthropomorphize there. But that's what I want to say on the global level, just by way of introduction, a few remarks. I also understand that we're interested in talking about the urban and rural. I'm originally from New York City, but I live in Minnesota now. I am still in the city, St. Paul, but agriculture and the rural areas are much more integrated in the people's consciousness here in a way that perhaps on the seaboards is not quite the case. And but that said, there is still very much a fundamental divide between urban and rural, not only as a kind of in the metabolic rift that they represent, between the divide between ecology and economy, but certainly politically. Both business parties here, the Republicans and Democrats, have taken full advantage of that, in which the Democrats pretend to represent the urban areas and Republicans pretend to represent the rural areas. But it's a divide and conquer that basically leaves much of the populace vulnerable to being taken advantage of in due course. And in essence, we have rural urban clashing together in foundational ways that are very much split the country. Whether we're teetering to a civil war, I don't think so, but it's only been 11 months so far, so I don't know what's going to happen. I do want to end up by showing a couple slides here. Our work at the Agroecology Rural Economics Research Corps, we're interested in trying to heal some of those rifts and an attempt to try to get people as far here in the US to, if you're someone in Philadelphia or Pittsburgh or LA, to somehow get in your consciousness and to worry and put on your political global space in your head that what's happening in rural Nebraska, in Iowa, matters to you. And I think this is in part in retrospect, the genius of Martin Luther King, his capacity to be able to get people around, not just around the country, but around the world, to get rural Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi into their heads and their consciousness. So if we can move in that direction, not only in the States, but around the world, we could bridge that terrible gap and in essence, find our way out of these crises, not only pandemics, climate change, etc. I'm with Max Weil on this, my co-author, that basically peasant agriculture is in essence the environmentalism of the poor, and it's in essence at this point our way forward in terms of getting out from underneath the emergence of the dialectical materialism that a lot of Western historical materialism rejected. So, nature whatever you want to call that, is foundationally integrated into the problems of the world, and we can't pretend otherwise anymore. So if I may, can I share the screen at this point? Is that possible? Have you given me permission?
Yes, you have permission, Rob.
Okay, thank you, thank you. Let's see if this works. Oh, good, look at that. I'm just going to show you a few things here. I don't think there's anything else on the screen I need to be embarrassed about, so please feel free to snoop. Not the NSA, however, they may do that, but hopefully not on this call anyway. You know, just a few slides. I'll be very informal about it. This is the UF COVID cases of, I think, about a few weeks ago per 100,000. You can see up into North Dakota, South Dakota, up in here that, you know, they have cases that are rivaling what wasn't in New York at the beginning of the outbreak. Here's another measure, at least since May 3rd, of the increases that have been happening in the middle of the country. Some of the reasons are the differences in the stay-at-home orders by date. Some counties and whole states didn't even issue stay-at-home orders at all, and others did very late. Meatpacking plants appear to be a driver of outbreaks, and we'll get into that about, well, in part why, you know, why is that happening? How did some of these rural counties that seem to be so far of the way, the ones to be hit worst? And these are measures of the food commodity supply lines, both at at two different kind of scales here, or small areas, and down the bottom by county level. And in essence, long story short, you can have a rural county that's just out in the deepest hinterland, but by virtue of its being integrated into the multinational food supply line, in essence, the hinterlands are brought right up against you know, the cities of the world that might, in essence, start off as the sources of global spread of the virus by virtue of the global travel network. So, you know, it's not about space, and it's not even about social distance. I mean, you can have all of a sudden integrated by these kind of circuits of capital that connect one side of the world to the other. And so moving away from the kind of GPS absolute geographies I talked about in terms of China being the source, we need to think more in terms of relational geographies, how what happens on one side of the world affects the other side. So in my mind, it's not just about China. China has a lot of foreign direct investment coming in such a way that has foundationally shifted its agriculture in such a way that it becomes something of a perfect storm for multiple strains. But, you know, like Goldman Sachs, New York City investment firm, straight up bought out $300 million in poultry and hog farms in provinces not too far from Wuhan. So, I mean, is that how that brought about? You know, I'm not blaming Goldman Sachs, but I mean, big picture about the processes by which, you know, the attempt to move us to another Cold War between the US and China or Russia. It's really, again, that kind of divide and conquer on the global scale. In fact, many of these countries are in essence bourgeoisie and these kind of interlocking directorates working together to squeeze the last of the land and labor for profit.
You have 2 minutes.
2 minutes, oh my God, okay, let me get through this. I'm gonna skip some things, how this is happening. COVID among farm workers, COVID in rural prisons, particulate matter is a problem. Rural medical resources aren't available. Some counties don't even have a hospital. Some counties, like Louisa here, which was in Iowa, kind of a doorway for COVID, some of those counties don't even have a doctor residing in their borders. So, you know, compare that to Vietnam with doctors and nurses everywhere in all these communities. So that's an obvious thing. I'm going to skip all this because I want to get to, you know, well, how do we get out of this, some of the stuff, or how does this, how might this, how agriculture in rural areas in the US relate to the emergence of COVID or the keeping COVID from coming in. So we've generated an index here, an enumerator. You have all these measures of kind of what we call regenerative agriculture or agroecology, whatever you like. There's a lot of debate over those terms and the colonialized aspects of them. But for now, just say things like intensive grazing, conservation, no-till, crop cover, livestock diversity. Denominator, you have variables that are more markers of conventional agriculture. So average farm side, pesticide use, particulate matter, methane, and the amount of food that's exported out of the county. You plot that out on for across the Midwest, 12 states in the Midwest, and some of these states are as large as countries. So, I mean, we're talking about a lot of very broad geographic ranges here, but in the greener it is, the more regenerative it is. And you can see that these agricultural practices differ not just by state, but across these kind of bioregions. So here in northern Minnesota and Wisconsin, you have a lot of regenerative ag, if only because you have a lot of forestry there. So it keeps a big ag that's typical for Iowa and southern Minnesota being able to go up there. That might change with the decline in mining up there. The politicals might be interested in bringing big ag up there. So in other words, all these distributions have not only biogeological reasons, but there's a deep there's ongoing political economies and also deep histories in terms of how the settler state arrived there and how they set up the different ways in which agriculture was done. So and regenerative ag farmers are basically have been blocked out. And I know I'm over 2 minutes, I apologize, but I really want to get to this. I'll make it quick, I promise. But just to say that regenerative ag is basically very much a minority practice in terms of using turning agriculture back away from an industrial economy back into a natural economy in which the soils and the clean water, all the ecosystem services are provided largely free by nature, in essence, and you don't have to rely on a company that's going to sell you all those inputs. So and it's about community control. It's about ecosystem health. It's about population health. All those things, all those nice things. But this is a plan in motion to try to do that. Agribusiness is a big problem, but the COVID has offered something of a doorway for better and for worse. Basically, regenerative farmers are stuck into conventional farming. All are free of that, all save one thing. The hog and livestock they produce have to go through industrial abattoirs. All the regional abattoirs and local ones were basically smashed in a land grab and an active land enclosure and all that you might recognize. And so what COVID's done is said, oh, we got to unplug out of there, because in other words, the large abattoirs have put regenerative farmers on a 2-year long waiting lists. So what they started to do is just buy up some of the regional abattoirs that are still available. So regenerative farmers are disconnecting out of that. This is only one example along the Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa region, but that's the movement, and it's actually changing in quite short order. What does it have to do with COVID? These are the COVID cases per 1,000 distributed on the top there. What combination of variables might explain this distribution? So we added a whole bunch of them, a pot of variables. Some of those variables were in the index I talked about, but you also have population by race. You have physicians available, you have mask use, you have a percent of population voted Republican, all sorts of things in there. What combination of variables best explains this? It's a very complex system with many weakly interacting variables, very common to those of us in the natural sciences looking at complex systems, very much at the heart of dialectical materialism as a method and also as an object. So, but a lot of this correlation matrix shows that many of the variables are only weakly related to each other. But when you put them all in, the general model that comes up, basically, don't worry, this is not going to be on the test or anything. So, but basically the numerator there, the one that has all those variables that are scaled for regenerative agriculture, is negatively associated with the COVID. So in essence, it acts as a kind of protection against it, not in any kind of biomedical sense, but socially speaking. Somehow it's filtered out. We don't know all the reasons why. It might have to do with not being connected into the broader transnational supply chains that I talked about earlier. The denominator rescaled down at the bottom there, marking all the conventional variables is positively associated with COVID, but also we have the things that we've been talking about all along now coming up in our quantitative analysis, the uninsured, percent uninsured, percent non-white, the slaughterhouses, the life expectancy at birth at 2014, which was under Obama. Long story short, that is at the general level, but we can actually see how these relationships differ within any one area, these kind of geographically weighted regressions. So this first variable here on the left here is the numerator. And just to wrap up here, you can actually see in blue where it's negatively associated with COVID, and orange where it's positively associated. So in essence, across these 10,055 counties across the Midwest, we can actually see how, even though we have this general model, that actually the relationships change from place to place, which is also what we would expect under a kind of dialectical materialist concept of reality. So I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Our next speaker, Lin Chun, she won't be using the camera, but we'll listen to her. Thank you. Thank you, Rob. Lin?
Okay, sorry. Thank you very much for inviting me. So my case today is China. I must say I've not been able to return to China since this past January, but I've, of course, followed events there and kept myself intimately informed through all kinds of channels. What I'm going to present today is not a research report. I haven't done any systematic research, but I'm happy to share just some information and thought. So I'll first say a word about China's response to the COVID-19 crisis, and then offer an explanation for its success so far. And finally, Beijing's post-COVID policy shift and its limitations. I'll just read out my notes to save time. It's also easier for me. Okay, first, fighting the coronavirus. Apparently, this virus attack is a punitive test of government leadership, public health system, and general social solidarity and capacity. In China, initially major mistakes were made in Wuhan, but the central government moved decisively in late January, locking down the megacity of Wuhan with its 11 million residents on 23rd of January, while the surrounding regions and other cities declared a public health emergency. In Johnson, veteran New York Times correspondent, often critical of Beijing, shared his personal experience. He encountered a flyer distributor in his residential building in Beijing a few days after Wuhan lockdown. The flyer was written by the municipal government in 8 languages as one of the means of government communication with citizens, along with official websites and social media accounts, which had the latest and most reliable information about the virus and advice on basic precautions to be taken. It also listed over 100 hospitals designated to handle fever in the greater Beijing area. This housing manager distributing flyers and making sure that everybody was informed and had a mask turned out to be among the mass of regular foot soldiers in China's combat against the virus, who worked tirelessly in a much severer situations around the country in the next few months. After early confusions and panics when hospitals in Wuhan were completely overwhelmed, the national approach adopted was science-based to break the chain of infection through strictly enforced lockdowns, fast and comprehensive testing, tracking, and treating every single patient, complete quarantine procedures, use of traditional medicine, simple messaging to help problems caught and solved timely, and extraordinarily strong and extensive logistic networks of supply and delivery. Whatever criticisms of many draconian measures, to the extent that villages were barricaded like medieval fortresses and housing compounds run as if under martial law, as Martin Wolf put it. Clear government directives and effective physical distancing became standard around the world. By the mid-year, the government has achieved its goal of accurate prevention and control. Johnson observed that, in quote, compliance in China was overwhelmingly voluntary. Beijing's streets were empty not because people were forced to stay home, but because they mostly accepted the leadership's message. The result is that China, the pandemic's epicenter, a country of 1.4 billion people, has had 4,634 deaths, a seventh of Spain's, an eighth of Italy's, a ninth of Britain's, and less than a 40th of the US. This was written on the 8th of October. Wolf points out that success in bringing the disease under control in Wuhan meant the halting of its spread across the country, so there was never a pan-China outbreak. Dr. Zhang Wenhong, leader of Shanghai Coronavirus Expert Group, who has enjoyed public trust in China as a sober professional voice, spoke at an October International Medical Conference that practically eradicating, well, his word, eradicating this disease by seizing the small window of 2 months in China is unseen in the history of human pandemic management. This speedy control also meant substantial mitigation of serious side effects of concentrating on one ailment while denying or delaying needed care for others. Now, this is, of course, just the first phase in China. New cases have emerged, and there is a predicted second wave this winter. China must continue to fight the pandemic within and beyond its borders, to collaborate with WHO and other countries in pursuit of the origin of the virus, along with researching, manufacturing, and distributing vaccines as a global public good as promised. So how has China done this? This is the second part. I've mentioned the general strict national approach of elimination and prevention. Both apparently depend on some sophisticated organization, efficient central local and local coordination, and broad cooperation at the grassroots level. The system has really worked to save lives. I'd highlight 3 key factors. The first is government determination and state capacity. Essentially, putting people first over economic priorities was the essence of China's answer to the pandemic. The stake of regime credibility is high. People are especially appreciative to see the residual party tradition of acting on the hardest tasks. Of the 496 health workers and volunteers who died on the front lines as of 29th of April, 328 were party members. Crucial is also the remaining state control over public resources and basic physical and financial infrastructure. Hence, macro efficiency of emergency planning, investment, and resource allocation. Over 200 medical teams of more than 42,000 medics with ample equipment were dispatched to Hubei from other cities. Large new hospitals were built in days. Convention and sports centers and student dormitories were remodeled into makeshift hospitals to treat less serious patients. Ventilators, protective suits, masks, and so on were massively produced on a wartime schedule. This Rob just mentioned this. Okay, the second factor is social mobilization. This is reminiscent of revolutionary mass line mobilization. Once again, ordinary people have shown an extraordinary ability of self-discipline and self-sacrifice, and indeed amazing energy in difficult times. There are also dedicated officials, community workers, and countless volunteers. A young Wuhan nurse rode her bicycle over 3 days and 2 nights just to join the fight in Wuhan city from her New Year holiday at home, more than 100 miles away after public transportation was shut down. She wasn't expected to do it. Taxi drivers and regular residents who had a car in Wuhan organized themselves via WeChat platforms to drive doctors, nurses, and patients back and forth for free. Tens of thousands of people volunteered to look after anyone in need, like the elderly left alone by their family blocked out, and to deliver daily necessities and carry out many other needed communal tasks. A third factor which I'd like to emphasize is the strategic importance of rural China. An outstanding message from reading the pandemic in China is about the countryside as the lifeline of the nation in crisis management and disaster relief, as the great rear for national security and support. By sustaining agricultural production, by self-organizing to guard villages and stop contagion, by sustention as well as securing grain and vegetable supplies to the cities under siege. And this is particularly important by receiving out migrants returning from their suspended urban jobs. Urban employment declined by 6% in the first quarter of 2020 due to lockdowns. This affected about 26.4 million people, mostly migrant workers. What is remarkable is that these workers had returned home safely in the rural areas where they still hold land right and have families to rely on. As such, villages are a shock absorber, as a friend of mine put it. This is a unique case of Chinese contention of collective land and equal land right, known as displacement without dispossession, which is a vital source of subsistence and security, especially at times of crisis. All these three factors, state capacity, mass mobilization, and the rural rear, are legacies of the revolution. As such, I'd argue that the explanation is not cultural in terms of some sort of East Asian values, but political, especially about the two local socialist traditions of a moral economy and collective volunteerism. Okay, finally, the third part, Beijing's post-COVID strategic shift. Socialism with Chinese characteristics, or many people would say capitalism with Chinese characteristics, has proven unsustainable since long before the pandemic. The first sign of reorientation appeared from the party's Central Committee meeting last month against the background of the global pandemic and all-round US trade war against China and the mounting domestic pressures. American new Cold Warriors seem to be doing China a great service or making a wake-up call that China needs to reassess its global self-position while abandoning illusions about G2, win-win, and the whole neoliberal utopia. However, so far, China's post-COVID response is centered in a plan of so-called national and transnational dual circulation, focusing on internal circulation or a more self-sufficient domestic market, but it's limited to the existing structure of the system and, among other things, missing an essential component of social policy change. Most regrettably, not on the agenda now is pulling the health system out of the deadlock of rounds and rounds of market-oriented reforms. These reforms have resulted in profit-driven public hospitals and privatized pharmaceutics. The best the government did during the crisis was to provide free treatment to all COVID patients. This emergency practice should be directly translated into a program toward universal free care as the only solution to the two serious public concerns, unaffordability and health inequality. The obstacle here is not financial but political, as attested by what China had achieved when it was many, many times poorer. The socialist experience of eliminating smallpox and the snail fever, for example, is telling. This experience featured a low-cost, comprehensive public network involving state investment, urban medical professionals taking turns to work in rural villages and train the locals, and an army of health maintenance soldiered by community clinics and barefoot doctors. Mao's 1958 poem celebrating rural masses collectively defeating snow fever, titled Farewell to the God of Plague, remains popularly aspirational. That victory and others on the health front explain how life expectancy had nearly doubled after 1949 by the eve of market reforms. So comprehensive and comparative lessons here are clear that healthcare is a realm for public management rather than market calculation. China's new 5-year plan could have topped rebuilding public medicine with universal coverage by skipping the opportunity. Socialist China, self-claimed, continues to allow itself in a crucial public welfare area to be behind both capitalist social democracies and former communist states. In this connection, let's finish by returning to the point on rural China concerning national food security and general protection, not to mention the absolute long-term necessity of shifting away from modern standardization of urbanism and developmentalism. In fact, snail fever made a return after decollectivization due to the loss of a moral economy of organized communal defense. To consolidate rather than weaken rural China as the nation's strategic rear due to its spatial depths and endless resources, especially human resource, in addition to equal land right and curbing breakneck urbanization, public free provision of healthcare along with education in the countryside is just too fundamental to be ignored. Okay, thank you. I'm done.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think it's striking to see the difference between the United States and China. So this, I think, is making us think a lot right now. Hamza, do you want to come in?
Yes. Thanks, Lucia, for the introduction, and thanks for inviting me to participate in this panel alongside Rob Wallace and Junlin. I prepared a few slides that I'm going to share now with you all. Do you see it?
Yes.
Great. Great. Okay. So before I delve into some of the details from North Africa, I would like to make a few preliminary points. My understanding of the title of this webinar, especially the decolonizing part, is twofold. First of all is to decenter our discussion from Eurocentric hegemonic discourses around the pandemic in order to see how other parts of the world are living through it, especially the global south. The second is to look at the fundamental root causes of the current crisis, which find their origins in the capitalist exploitation of humanity and nature, as well as the imperial economic recolonization of large parts of the world in the last 3 to 4 decades. I would argue that this kind of radical systematic analysis and interpretation of the predicament would help us understand the various forms of resistance that emerge and also assist us in imagining and building alternatives. So the coronavirus pandemic coincides with and exacerbates a multifaceted global crisis: political, economic, social, environmental, and climatic. In other words, we are currently experiencing a crisis of a patriarchal, racial capitalist system, which will have grave and disproportionate impacts on the vulnerable and marginalized groups, especially in the global south. COVID-19 pandemic is not merely a health issue, it is also an environmental one. And thanks to the work of Rob Wallace and others, We know that the emergence of the coronavirus is linked to the capitalist destruction of ecosystems through intensive agribusiness and industrial animal farming, as well as the commodification of nature through extractivism, land grabbing, deforestation, and loss of habitat. Basically, we can't consider this pandemic as an isolated event and related to the global ecological crisis. What we are living now is a taster of worse things to come if we don't take the necessary measures and implement just solutions to the unfolding climate crisis. In North Africa, as in other parts of the continent and beyond, the crisis has been mainly economic so far. But the second wave is proving much worse than the first one. In terms of number of infections and fatalities, Morocco and Egypt, alongside South Africa, have been the worst hit in the continent according to official numbers. The economic consequences in Northern African countries have been catastrophic on poverty and unemployment levels. These countries simply do not have the financial means to implement financial packages or measures like the ones we've seen in the global north. Also, the countries that rely on tourism and foreign currency remittances are even more affected. One important point to bear in mind here is the informalization of the economies of the global south. According to the International Labour Organization, almost 1.6 billion informal economy workers are significantly impacted by the COVID pandemic, leading to a 60% decline in their earnings. In North Africa, more than half the labor force is employed in the informal economy, typically working without contracts, unions, or access to social protection schemes. The region's informal workers are a powerful symbol of social injustice around which protest movements have rallied. It is no minor detail that the incident that set the Arab uprisings into motion 10 years ago was the self-immolation of an informal street fruit vendor, Mohammed Bouazizi. The informal economy, as I understand it, doesn't only absorb part of the reserve army of labor, but also subsidizes more predatory and exploitative forms of capital accumulation. The masses of the unemployed, the underemployed, finance lumpen proletariat, the precariat, the surplus and disposable population are made to accept extremely low wages and incomes that are even cutting into what they need for social reproduction. The pandemic will further dispossess these already marginalized sections of society and push some of them to risk their lives in the Mediterranean, trying to reach fortress Europe for a better life. Undocumented migration, what is called harga in North Africa, has increased lately, even during the pandemic, and the EU is escalating and strengthening its inhumane, racist border imperialism. The start of 2020 has seen an unprecedented oil price crash. The plunge in the oil prices was unparalleled as the escalating pandemic accelerated the profound shock to the fossil fuel industry. The impact was brutal among oil companies, especially in the high-cost US shale oil sector. As for oil-producing countries such as Algeria, Libya, Nigeria, and others, more economic strain was added to the economies with mounting budget deficits and the hemorrhaging of their financial reserves. For example, according to the IMF, Algeria now needs an oil price of $157 for the barrel just to balance its budget, and the current prices are around $45. So you can imagine what would that entail economically: more painful austerity measures, more unemployment and poverty, and so on. Even before the crisis, this is not a natural state of affair. The extreme vulnerability of countries like Algeria to cyclical fluctuation of commodity prices is caused by an extractivist model of development that has been shaped since colonialism and consolidated in the neoliberal era with the complicity of comprador classes. That model entrenches the subordinate insertion of these economy within a hierarchical global division of labor, on one hand as providers of cheap natural resources and cheap labor, and in the other as a market for industrialized economies, maintaining therefore relations of imperialist domination and neocolonial hierarchies. These relations are also maintained by debts. The international financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank impose their dictates through loan conditionalities in order to open up economies for more plunder. The pandemic also manifests itself in a debt crisis for so many countries in the global south, some of which are more affected than others. We saw the news about Lebanon and Zambia defaulting on the payments of their debts. So let's see what all these debts and neoliberal conditionalities achieved in North Africa in terms of public services. So the World Health Organization recommends a threshold of 4.45 doctors, nurses, midwives per 1,000 inhabitants. In Morocco, it's only 0.72, in Egypt, 0.79. The amount of money and finances spent on debt services is 10 times more than the public health budget in Morocco, 7 times more in Egypt, and 4 times in Tunisia. And all this absorbs much more and larger parts of the education budget and public investments. So during that crisis, the IMF and the World Bank estimate that what is needed for the economic recovery in the whole MENA region, not just North Africa and the Middle East, amounts to about $170 billion. But where would that money come from? The response of these IFIs and the ruling classes is more debts. Egypt already received around 8 billion from the IMF and the World Bank, and is trying to contract more from other lenders. Morocco, already $4 billion have been contracted, and it's the same story in other countries like Tunisia, Sudan, Iraq, and Mauritania, and so on. This will only add to people suffering and deterioration of livelihoods in these regions. The pandemic is also a food sovereignty issue for African countries and others in the global south. At this particular moment, it is definitely worth remembering the powerful words of the Burkinabe revolutionary leader Thomas Sankara, when he said, "Look at your plates when you eat these imported grains of rice, corn, and millet. That is imperialism. He who feeds you controls you." The food dependency of most of countries in the south has been intensified by the agricultural policies of big capitalists who produce to export what the world markets require. And basically, this is ecological imperialism, which is broadly speaking the subjugation of economic, political, and social institutions of a peripheral country for the biophysical and metabolic needs of a core country, with all the externalized and displaced social and environmental costs. This is the reality experienced by countries in North Africa and the Middle East, which have become one of the largest global importers of foodstuffs. Egypt and Algeria, for example, top the list of the biggest importers of wheat in the world. We saw how these two countries were extremely vulnerable during the pandemic earlier on, as they struggled to purchase wheat in international markets, especially when countries such as Kazakhstan, Vietnam, and Russia have suspended their grain exports. This just demonstrates the non-sustainability and fragility of these global value chains and reveals the lopsidedness of a global food system where North African countries export water and land-intensive produce such as tomatoes, citrus, strawberries, and flowers in order to import basic foodstuff such as grains. These countries live at the mercy of food markets, a reality which has subjected them to regular bread riots as food prices have risen during the last 40 years. The most recent are the protests, including in Egypt and Morocco, resulting from food crisis in 2008. Now let's see the impact quickly of the pandemic in rural areas and specifically on small-scale food producers. In Tunisia, for example, confinement, lockdown, and curfew measures restricted the mobility of food producers like farmers, fishers, and cattle breeders, paralyzing rural dynamics and having a negative impact on production and commercialization. Moreover, the decision to close down wholesale markets for 4 days a week earlier on undermined the distribution of commodities to markets and favored speculators over farmers. In Morocco and Egypt, small farmers, agricultural workers, as well as fisher folks carry out their work in the absence of any form of protection, and there is no form of support directed specifically to them. Meanwhile, agricultural, 2 minutes?
I'm so sorry, you have 2 minutes.
Yeah, all right. I'll finish in 2 minutes.
Okay, great, thanks.
Meanwhile, agricultural and fishing capitalists continue to show their disregard for the workers' lives. They deny the right to preventive health measures, both in transportation, inside production units, and on boats, while benefiting from state support, tax concessions, loan facilities, and other benefits. On top of all these forms of dispossession and pauperization, the pandemic has been a blessing to some authoritarian regimes, such as in Morocco, in Algeria, and Egypt. Before the pandemic, millions of Algerians were in the streets asking for radical democratic change and the demilitarization of the republic. However, the regime took the opportunity of the halt of the massive protests to double down on its repressive measures in order to bury the popular movement, or what is called the Hirak in Algeria. In the midst of all this bleakness, people are not passive victims. They organize and resist despite the huge challenges they face. Workers, farmers, and fishers fight for their rights and build independent unions. The uprisings we saw in 2019 and early 2020 in Sudan, Algeria, Iraq, Lebanon are part of the protracted revolutionary process that has been unleashed in the region a decade ago. Fundamentally, these revolts, alongside others in Chile, Bolivia, the Black Lives Matter movement, and others, are expressions of a deep rejection of a global system that is not fit for purpose at the social, ecological, and even biological level. I'll end with a few thoughts on the way forward. In the short term, I think some of the priorities in North Africa and more generally in the global South are, first of all, an unconditional cancellation of debts. There are currently various citizen initiatives that go in that direction from Africa, the MENA region, Asia, and Latin America. And this needs to be linked to the rehabilitation and protection of public services such as education, healthcare, and transport. In the medium to long run, what is needed is a complete overhaul of the current development model. This won't happen on its own or overnight, but need to be achieved through collective class struggle, alliances, and solidarities. In that respect, the rural-urban divide needs to become the rural-urban continuum. It's not simply an alliance between industrial working classes and the peasantry, but a broader concept of the working people, as Isa Shivji articulated it, where the victims of neoliberal, racial, and imperial capitalism are engaging collectively for popular sovereignty over their wealth, resources, foods, and livelihoods. Thank you.
Well, thank you. If people want to unmute themselves, I think, yes. I really, yeah. Thank you so much. This has been really inspiring and very interesting. So I think we can start collecting interventions. If you want to write your name on the chat, and our next speaker, he promised he will keep it within 5 minutes, is Baba Ai from, well, he will talk about Nigeria. So Baba, do you want to start, please? And in the meantime, please write your name in the chat if you want to intervene, ask a question, make a comment, whatever.
Yeah, all right. Thank you, Lucia, for the invitation. I'll keep it short. Yesterday, the British Parliament started discussions on sanctions against the federal government of Nigeria on the NSAID. So what I'll do is to help contextualize this and give a broad overview of the contending forces and issues. The NSAID protest was the largest for generations, and it rocked the country for weeks in October. It was drowned in blood on the 20th of October after weeks of young people being on the streets. The SARS is the Special Anti-Robbery Squad. But police brutality had been there for a while, particularly with SARS, which there have been several reports by Amnesty International, the last being just 2 months before the protest, which shows the bestiality of the squad and how they would arrest people and beat out confessions from them and get monies from their families. And extrajudicial killing was normal. So it was the news of someone being killed that sparked this. But there was a broader context to this, and that context is worsening social and economic conditions, particularly for young people. In 2018, Nigeria became the country with the largest number of poor people in the world. 115 million out of the 240 million population live below the poverty line. And the young people in particular are worst hit, with 1 out of every 2 young person effectively being unemployed. 3/4 of the population of the labor force work in the informal economy. And meanwhile, when as part of COVID interventions, loans credit was given to informal economy operators, you required to present property deeds, which shut out the large bulk of young people there, as well as the poorer people in the informal economy. So it was within this context, it was this incendiary context that such a spark led to the flames that it was. Now, a missing social force was organized labor, and it was that the trade union bureaucracy understood the incendiary situation. On the 28th of September, there was to have been a general strike by the 2 trade union centers. It was called off at the last minute, and the general secretaries of both centers pointed out that, look, they realized that there was so much anger outside and they didn't want to start what could go beyond their control. But in the unfolding period now, there's going to be pressure from below, even within the trade unions. Before this NSAS protest, the largest protest we had was in 2012, and it was generalized with mass strikes called by the trade unions. But interestingly, they wanted to avoid that at that point in time too. But rank and file workers made it clear that, look, if we don't fight back, we'll be stoned on the streets. We are getting to such a situation now. But looking at the NSAS itself, you could see how demands went quickly from no to police brutality, NSAS, to take on much more cogent issues like, end the salaries of senators and House of Reps members, end injustice, and even Buhari must go before the movement was drowned in blood. There were several reasons for this within what was supposedly a leaderless movement. And within that movement, there was actually both collaboration and contestation between, I would say, a liberal wing of it and a left wing of it. The left wing been organized mainly around the Coalition for Revolution Corps, which had organized a series of protests from 5th of August last year across the country for its Revolution Now campaign. Now, when you look at the narrative in the mainstream media, particularly in the West, it's presented simply as, a middle class movement and all that. But this is just part of the story, because what you see, the more working class areas where you had the more radical demands coming out from this. But the focus was much more on, like in Lagos. Lagos had 2 main centers, actually 4, but the other two were on the outskirts. Two places with thousands, up to 4,000 to 5,000 people. One was Alausa, the other was Lekki. Focus was on Lekki because Lekki was the more middle class suburb. While at Alausa, there was contestation between the liberals and core activists, with the liberals living in anger at a point in time. Now at Lekki, people were sleeping there and now when on the 20th of October, both places were attacked. One of the benefits of having, seasoned activists on the ground in Alausa was that a more orderly retreat was organized. People were still killed there, but only 2 people were killed. I mean, even 2 is not only per se. And these were by snipers. But when the state drowned this movement in blood, it didn't end there. What was mainly a peaceful protest now spilled out to the streets. Campaign youth took over. I mean, there was mass anger. At least 205 police stations were burnt down. Some 22 police officers were killed, and so on and so forth. But the state has met this with repression. You have had bank accounts of NSAS activists frozen, no-fly list, being put on no-fly list, and so on and so forth. Now, where we are now, and that is why I started with the debate in the parliament yesterday in Britain, is that, look, this thing it's been reduced to just that, look, you have a corrupt and repressive regime in Nigeria, but the systemic connections need to be emphasized. I mean, SARS itself was both funded and trained by the British government. This needs to be stated. And also we need to have voices of support, from working class, from revolutionary forces on the ground, because there's debate now with the liberal wing of the movement at the time, now pushing forward sanctions from the British and, as the messianic way forward. And we're saying no. We're saying no. What we need more of is for solidarity from below, linking our struggles in Nigeria with the global struggle for a better world. Thank you. I hope I kept within the 5 minutes.
That's great anyway. Thank you so much, Baba. And yes, I completely agree with your conclusions, and we need to oppose the logic of international solidarity to the logic of imperialist sanctions. So I have 2 questions already. One is, Lea, do you want to, can you ask your question, or shall I ask it?
No, can you please ask it, because it's a bit chaotic. I'm listening, but there's a lot of other people interfering, so. Okay,
that's fine. So I will start by basically reading Lea's question, which is mainly directed to Lin Chun. So what is the perception in China of the collapse of liberal states in the face of the pandemic? Does this feature in these discourses of the government? And do you think, Lin Chu, that this consolidates nationalist discourses in China, or does it encourage China to take the initiative in criticizing capitalism?
Okay, thank you, Lea, for the question.
Sorry, sorry, 1 second, because I think the second question is linked actually, and John sent it in advance of the meeting. And he said, well, he was asking basically why the Chinese and the Indian bourgeoisie seem to be intent on bringing hundreds of millions of more people from the countryside into mega cities, and whether industrial agriculture is able to support them in the long term. So I think these questions are probably connected. So I wanted to add this question as well. And if you have other questions, please write your name in the chat. Please, sorry, Lin Chu, for interrupting.
Sorry. Thank you very much for the questions. I'm afraid I think the discourse in China is mainly nationalist rather than anti-capitalist. I mean, apparently because the government, the official discourse is not anti-capitalist. And the whole thing about this global pandemic is seen not as a result of capitalist mismanagement, but about, government strength, state capacity, and so on. So this is quite unfortunate, but I'm not sure whether it's going to change a bit in the next period. Okay, concerning urbanization, I mean, the simple answer is that no, it's not sustainable. And with China's population size, if you don't have food self-sufficiency, you can't, unlike other small countries, China just cannot rely on international supply of food. It has to rely on itself. And if you continue to push urbanization, green production would become a problem. So I think this is quite true, quite simple, that I think the government should really seriously think about that, and instead of supporting, agribusiness and breakneck urbanization, rather support petty farming and better organization of the peasants to sustain the countryside. Okay.
Thank you. I have two questions from Mohammed, who is one of our MA students in international political economy. So his first question is for Rob Wallace. And he asks, so knowing the human and material costs and the long-term adverse global consequences of the pandemic, what do you think it will take for policymakers and those in position of power to take heed of scientific advice so that we can prevent the emergence of future pandemics? And to Lin Chun and Hamza Hamushin, so basically, how do we fix the fact that market-driven capitalism points towards or is interested in infinite economic growth, and the greed is at the very heart of the system?
Well, I'll just jump in and just, I'm going to take a long view that addresses Mohammed's question in China as well. And I kind of take on the world systems theorist view of how capitalism merged and centers of capital. You have cycles of accumulation where money's turned into capital, and that typically goes hand in hand with building out imperial infrastructure. And then on the other side of accumulation, as the empire falls, the capital is basically turned back into money. In other words, the bourgeoisie cash out and head for the hills, as it were. And so, starting with the Italian city-states, then Spain, then the Dutch, then the British, and then the US. So US seems to be on its far end of its cycle of accumulation in rather short order, and cashing out. And, when the US defunds WHO, it's not a sign of power, it's a sign of weakness. It's a sign that we're no longer post-World War II in the business of running the world capitalist system so that bourgeoisie can profit around the world, wherever they are. So as I said, there's these interlocking directorates of capital and bourgeoisie who are working together. So the notion is that China's gonna, take up the next cycle. And it has all the earmarks of it, of turning money into capital, of building imperial infrastructure. As was brought up in the previous question, the notion of, while the rural rear has always been an important part of China's capacity as a country to survive and prosper, that has been, the rural areas have been taking on much of the damage of capital accumulation on the seaboard. So it goes environmentally, it goes to socially. It's been the greatest human migration is largely from China rural provinces to the coast. So, you know, and we understand in part, right? Because out of post-World War II, you know, you have the BRICS countries deciding, hey, we're going to go our way. We're not just going to let the US and EU exploit us. We're going to exploit ourselves. And for better or for worse, that's not for me to say. But along with that ends up these countries, China, Brazil, India, start cutting into their own rural areas and last of their wild stands in such a way that increases the interface between pathogens and the local livestock and the local labor, leading to these increasing rates of emergence of these diseases that now can get on the next plane and make it to Miami Beach in a matter of days. So that's the context of it. So the question, of course, is that, you know, what about everybody else? And this gets to Hamza's point about, you know, I tend to think it's important to know what the US and China are up to. They're the big giants on the stage, and when they sneeze, the rest of the world might catch a cold, as it were. But in addition, as a third campus, the notion that countries in between might have decisions to make about what else to do otherwise. And that's all very difficult because the damage that's accruing is global in nature, right? So you've got not only pandemics, but climate change requires global solidarity, but you still have actors on the stage that are acting as if Earth has a total, as a resource is totally available all the time. Global North still treating Global South as both its refrigerator and its toilet. And it's not something sustainable even on those grounds, those horrible grounds that have left hundreds of millions of dead. Now, the question, Mohammed's question as to science, where does that fit in? Well, science has been hand in glove with these cycles of accumulation right from the start. So when the Portuguese made their way to those first islands out in the Atlantic there, they came across peoples and landscapes that they didn't understand. So they recruited incipient science into its imperial role to decode those landscapes and people and recode them back into a form by which they can be turned into commodities. And that has gone on since, through the cycles, through the various centers of capital, from the Italian city-states or from Portugal and Spain on. Science has been used as a means by which capital turns nature into profit and people into labor. So this is the difficulty in all this, is that you have incredibly bright, brilliant, amazing people. And it's kind of the centered point that I was surprised would end up being the center point of my book on dead epidemiologists. Why do I call it dead epidemiologists? Because there's a lot of bright, brilliant people walking around who are in essence the walking dead, as it were, and because they cannot assimilate how the premises that they underlying their own scientific work is what helped drive the emergence of these pathogens in the first place. And so we have science, and then you have science, right? I like to think that I'm not part of that. Who knows? I don't know what premises I have been inculcated with, even as I've been very much opposed to all this, and I'm discovering new stuff every day. So there's a deprogramming that's necessary to be able to get out and move toward a more people's science, a science for the people, that in essence fills in the research gaps that have developed as universities have become neoliberalized and have in essence turned themselves into agribusiness R&D. And so now what we have is a bunch of, thousands of brilliant, wonderful scientists who are caught between the realities of a pandemic and climate change, and also the service that they continue at the feet of the money bags that basically help run their labs. And so, you'll see these kind of incoherent takes on COVID and climate change in a way that attempts to do both things at once. So to answer your question, Mohammed, I appreciate I'm sorry about the getting to that, but the answer is science does have a role to play in helping us get out of this. But our job, I think, is to, in essence, open windows and doors by which many a scientists, bright and brilliant as they may be, have to, in essence, be deprogrammed out of the premises of the system that brought about the crisis in the first place.
Thank you. Thank you for the longue durée approach of your answer. And Lin Chun, do you want to come in?
Okay, just concerning the question about developmentalism or growth-centered GDPism, I think developmentalism is really a pure ideology. I mean, the problem in China is that this ideology has been hegemonic for 40 years. It's very hard to change, but it's really time for people to shift to consider the cost of China's growth. I mean, the growth is true, but it's very, the cost is very high. Social, human, environmental, and so on. So I think altogether I agree with what Rob says. It's time that the superstition of growth as such, and along with its standardized modernization, be renounced, even in China, even in the global South, where historically nations and peoples have had every right to develop. So the issue is really not, foregoing a legitimate right as an act of self-sacrifice. No, just merely about hard constraints on ecological finalities. Imagine environmental consequences of so-called social middling of China. That is a sort of a slogan in China, social middling of China's size by expanding already hugely wasteful models of urban consumption. Think about, hundreds of millions of people become so-called middle class. So I think the question is rather about becoming free from developmentalist alienation, as well as free from immediate harms of pollutions or shortage of essential resources imposed on everybody, everywhere. So there is, apparently contradictions between the logic of endless accumulation of capital and our finite Earth. It's proven not manageable within the present system.
Thank you. Hamza?
I think I'll just emphasize what Rob and Lunchin already mentioned. The questions that Mohammed asked are very important. I think they deserve more time for discussion. But just talking about our obsession of market-driven growth and a lot of ecological Marxists showed how unsustainable it is in the theory of the metabolic rift. That compulsion to accumulate ever more capital undermines that metabolic equilibrium that would allow a society to live in harmony with nature. So to look at it just from the context of North Africa, the obsession of market-driven growth, we see agribusiness, like countries like Indonesia and Morocco and Egypt, exporting water-intensive products. And we need to remember that these countries are arid to semi-arid, so they don't have a lot of water resources. And then exporting virtually their waters towards Europe. And in the long run, this is not sustainable. And that question also resonates when we talk about the climate crisis. When we talk about the pandemic, we need to remember that this is just a taster for the climate crisis. If governments do not take action, that will be catastrophic especially for countries in the global south. And on the question of development, I completely agree with Lunchin around Chunlin, sorry, around the discourse of development. Yes, it is as some scholars argued, it's an ideology that has been imposed on countries in the global south. Actually, it replaced the old colonial relations between the colonizers and the colonized to become between developed and developing countries within, a globalized capitalist economy, within basically being subordinate into that global capitalist economy. So we need to rethink all of these things and to rethink those development models, but that necessitate transnational solidarities and transnational resistance, because I don't believe that revolution can just happen in one country.
Thank you. So the atmosphere is a bit heating up now, and there are a lot of questions in the chat. So since it's getting a bit late, I think we should collect a bit of questions and then probably ask you to get back, including Baba, at the end. So this is, unless you want to intervene, I'm going to read or ask people to read their questions. Okay, there was a follow-up question from John saying, is it necessary for socialism to outproduce capitalism? Then there is Katya Lachowicz. Katya, do you want to come in, unmute yourself?
Yeah, very quickly. I think the question really comes from a perspective that I have coming from the UK, where mutual aid has been sort of co-opted by neoliberal volunteerism. And we've been talking a lot about the rural-urban divide and the working class areas having more radical demands and the ideas of collective volunteerism. And so I was just interested how that relates to sort of more structured interventions of mutual aid and whether those structured interventions have been largely urban. Perhaps, I don't know if I need to expand on that, but I don't want to take people's time, but perhaps that's enough.
Thank you. Tak Lang? Ta? So, I don't know, task question was like, what would panel members suggest when it comes to Western populations' reluctance to the adoption of simple measures that Asian mindset may have stalled the of simple measures that have been taken up in Asia much earlier? I don't fully understand this question. Because there is this idea that basically, well, the free world, like Boris Johnson called the UK, is less keen on these measures, while Asian people would be more keen. And so, like, a friend of Tess basically says that Western governments are trying to impose East Asian approaches on freedom-loving people. Nicholas Parker. Nicholas, do you want to ask the question yourself?
Sure, I can try. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Thanks.
Just from reading a little bit of Rob's books, it has become clear, that this is an age of pandemics that has been created, and everyone could see this coming. They just did not know exactly where and when would be the one that would break through and affect the whole world. And I guess while we're talking about what should be done and what needs to be done, I'm just interested in hearing what the thoughts are on what we should expect from the ruling classes in the United States, Europe, and even in China when it comes to how they're going to use this new pandemic-prone world to continue their goals of capital accumulation, strategic dominance, geopolitical control, and all of those things, just like we see them do with the global warming, where the melting Arctic is seen as a place to gain military power or make profits. I hope that's clear. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Nicholas. There is a question from Jessica Norty for Hamza, especially on Algeria.
Can I read it out, Lucia? Is that okay?
Yes, yes, that's fine.
Thanks, Lucia. So yeah, I wanted to just raise the question of the Hirak in Algeria and the way that it explicitly challenged the capitalist extractivist model through the marches and the messaging and the banners, which was so inspiring at the time in 2019. And I just wondered now, despite the difficulties, whether this is really continuing online in the same way, if degrowth, climate crisis is also being discussed in Algeria, and whether the other movements in Africa are learning from that experience. Algeria stopped fracking and now, you know, they want to go and drill in the Okavango Delta. Is there a sharing of experience from your experience or knowledge? And thanks for all the wonderful presentations.
Thank you. Thank you, Jessica. Is there anyone else? Is this my internet connection? Sorry. Is there anyone else who wants to come in, ask a question to the speakers? Yes, Lawrence Wong, please.
The vaccines, I understand, that are coming on board are directly a result of the fact that scientists shared and work on the DNA code around the world. It was shared 10 days on January the 10th, and on January the 20th, you know, we discovered that it was, you know, human-to-human transmission was possible. So on that level, there's huge international cooperation. My question really is, does the argument of Chinese exceptionalism actually help us, you see? That all these developmental models which we find problems with, you know, do they not come from, if you like, the dynamics of capital accumulation? Because when I was in LSE in 1980, the Soviet Union and China were excluded from any possible explanations because they were communists, they were exceptional. And just I feel that the idea that China is exceptionalist, of course, used badly by Trump on that level. And on the other level, saying that China is somehow exceptionally better, doesn't help all of us, yeah? And just, I guess that's the important question, you see, as we move forward. One thing about the COVID is really bad that it's shared internationally, but it's something we have all experienced. And I think we need to move forward and not look at, you know, exceptionalism on one side, but that we move forward together as, you know, a common humanity.
Thank you. Well, if there aren't other questions, I also have a question, a few questions actually. Well, I wanted to thank Lin Chun for her presentation. I found a description of the kind of revolutionary legacies and the popular mobilization and how it has been crucial to addressing the pandemic in China, really fascinating. And so I wanted to ask you, well, okay, there is this more nationalist response right now, but we also know that there have been labor strikes and unrest in China, especially since the beginning of the 2000s and so on. So I wanted to know if there is something developing, like more critical positions also with regard to the government's position developing in China. And what do you think is the future of this labor movement in China? So this would be my question for you. And well, I also want to thank Hamza for his speech and Baba as well. And I think it's very important to link what's happening in Europe and the kind of extractivist policies that our government and our multinational corporations are carrying out in North Africa and the rest of Africa, and see how struggles against extractivism and revolutionary movements are raising demands that are also demands about our future here. And so I was wondering what we can do more concretely in order to support these struggles. And I think this is also very important in order to undermine the nationalist politics that is becoming so influential here, in the sense that we tend not to see what's going on the other side of the Mediterranean as something that concerns us in first person. I don't know how to say, like we tend just to see source of migrant workers, competitors and so on, rather than see the revolutionary potential of the struggles and how they can also well, support us here in facing the situation we are living right now. Well, I see there is a question from Magnus. I'm curious about Rob's thoughts on the regenerative agriculture and its potential scalability. He's also a student in our MA in International Political Economy. Okay, is there any other question? If not, I don't know who wants to start. Maybe Hamza, do you want to start?
Okay, I think there are a lot of great questions. Maybe I'll ask with the one specifically addressed to me around Algeria and the Hirak. The Hirak means movement in Arabic. So the popular movement that has been around since February 2019, and it was so inspiring because it was national. It was millions of people in the streets, all of classes of the society, men and women, young and old. Really, it was so inspiring to see. And the movement, maybe it wasn't anti-capitalist as such, but definitely it has some progressive germs where we can mobilize around certain progressive issues like sovereignty on natural resources, because the movement rejected many counter-revolutionary measures, such as the new oil law, the hydrocarbon law, that was very multinational friendly, offering more concessions, more tax incentives, and the opportunity to use more destructive technologies such as fracking and offshore drilling. So offshore drilling is the first in Algeria. It will be in the Mediterranean. And fracking, I think it already started, but we don't know what's going on. There is a lack of transparency around this. I argued in my writing that what was taking place and what is taking place, even despite the pandemic, I still believe that the movement would come back, because the ruling classes right now are facing a huge crisis. It's a political crisis because the different factions are not agreeing, are not homogeneous, they have different interests, and also because the current president is sick and he's in Germany, treating himself in Germany. Look at the state of the healthcare, of what they say, the regional power in North Africa, which is truly shameful. I said I was arguing that what was taking place in Algeria is a continuation of the decolonization struggle, because people are clearly making the link between the situation right now and the colonial situation under French colonialists. They are mentioning the martyrs, they are linking the struggles, they are calling, even saying Algerians want independence. They know that the ruling classes are not serving the interests of the country. They know that their popular resources and natural resources are being plundered by multinationals. So in that respect, there are some progressive elements. You mentioned the anti-fracking movement in 2015. Yeah, that was a few months of protests in the Sahara, which is a marginalized area in southern Algeria where most of the oil and gas resources come from. And people did not rise simply because sometimes in the West, when we interpret those movements, we interpret them as purely environmental. People rose against fracking, so yeah, they care about the environment. Yes, there is an environment element in those struggles. Definitely, people are rising to safeguard their water, their environment, they are against pollution and so on. But socioeconomic issues prime on the ecological elements. So people rise against the violence of the neoliberal system and its elites, rise against underdevelopment, rise against poor infrastructures and so on. I think maybe I'll venture and answer another question if you don't mind, Lucia.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So what should we expect from the working classes? I think from what we see, at least in the West, in the UK and in the US, I've seen them politics of disaster capitalism, politics of class war. It's clear that the people who are gonna pay for this pandemic, we see here huge economic packages. The UK is borrowing a lot of money, but we need to ask who's gonna pay. Is it the super rich? Is it the multinationals? Is it companies like Amazon? Is it British multinationals? Unfortunately, I think I'm pessimistic about this, but I think it's not them who are going to pay the price, but it would be the working classes and the poorest of society. So in that respect, I think the working classes are already pushing forward that agenda. Maybe I'll stop here and let others maybe to answer.
Okay, thank you very much. Mohammed, did you want to ask anything before? I think this is your last chance if you want to ask a question. Mohammed?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. Yeah, I think I can see the picture being built, which is the industrialists, the capitalists. They are doing historically what they're supposed to do. And then you have the perhaps 99% versus the 1%. I'm amazed and staggered that why is it that we have failed as masses to be able to protect our livelihood, to have a decent living, to protect our ecology, and to also discharge our responsibility for future generations who will have to inherit this planet. So while I can see the exploiters, but we are in the picture, whether there will be the global, people in China, in the Muslim world, in North Africa, or the people, going to food banks in the United States, in the United Kingdoms, the richest countries in the world. So where are our responsibility? What is it that we are not doing because of which we have the fate and the suffering that we find ourselves in? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, another student of mine, Victor, is asking a question mainly for Rob about your use of dialectical materialism in relation to agriculture, particularly regarding regenerative farming practices and agroecology. Okay, I think I will call Lin Chun next, and then Rob, because he told me that he tends to speak a lot, so I will first call Lin Chun for my time management priorities. Sorry, guys. So Lin, please.
Okay, thank you very much for the comments and questions. I'm not sure I can really respond to all that, but I'll start with following Hamza on quoting Arundhati Roy. I like what she said in, I think it was back in April. I think she was right. She was saying that in the midst of this terrible despair of the pandemic, which offers us a chance to rethink the doomsday machine we have built for ourselves. Nothing could be worse than a return to normality. So indeed, there is no normality to return to. And this is absolutely true for China. And this is related to the comment on China's old model of growth. I wouldn't say it seeks any geopolitical domination, but it's like Belt and Road program was, it received any criticisms and so on. And there is also a lot of domestic criticisms in China as well, especially because China has its own, a lot of very serious social problems to address. So people would say, well, what about we deal with our own problems first? And I think for me, it has a point there. China need to build itself into something. I don't think it's clear about what it wants to be. If it can build itself into something really, in the official terms like socialist civilization and so on, which should necessarily imply, democracy, freedom, and public welfare, and all that. If you can achieve that, then you can be appealing to the world. And before that, I think it's very hard for BRI and other programs to really succeed. This is related to this comment on Chinese exceptionalism. I don't think this is about Chinese exceptionalism. I would say if there is anything exceptional about China, or any, like I would use the word advantage for China to overcome certain, capitalist problems, it would be the fact that China has had a great social revolution. So that revolutionary experience have left a lot of legacies, and they are still alive in Chinese society. So they, in other words, there are overlapping experiences of socialist experiences, capitalist experiences, even pre-capitalist and then pre-socialist experiences. So in that word, in that sense, it's full of contradictions. And if China can use its socialist experiences, can take that advantage, it might have a chance to do better. I wouldn't say it's a cultural exceptionalism. It's probably a political advantage. And about labor protest, absolutely true. I really like it. Need to notice that there is not only official China, there is also a social China, there is also a workers' China, and so on. And workers' protests have also attracted in recent times, like student support. Marxist young people went to the site, like in Guangdong, to support workers on strike, and so on. So in that sense, the communist regime in China is, as we all know, it's more nominal than real. But what is remarkable is that socialism really is meaningful. It rules. It how do I put it? It rings truer with the opposition than the government. So in other words, the opposition or the labor movement, the workers on strike and protest still can use the socialist legitimacy, the socialist ideological ideas for their own struggle, in the official terms. And that is an advantage as well in China. So in that sense, I wouldn't say there is a West-East divide. I think it's probably misleading. It would be a socialist capitalist divide, or a historical distinction between countries like China and the capitalist states. I'm not sure about this rural-urban divide. I think it's a very important observation about mutual aid and the relationship between these two sectors. And the Chinese, I mean, this is probably exceptional situation, is that there is a divide, but that divide is not only negative, it also has a positive aspect. As I mentioned, this time the countryside has really received returned migrant workers and so on. And the key there is really about this preservation of collective land and equal land right. So in terms of urban-rural cooperation, that fundamental conditions could play a role. Okay, I'll stop here.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Rob, please.
All right, well, thank you so much. I really appreciate all the questions. They're wonderful. And my excitement and curiosity are in competition with my failing memory as a middle-aged man. So I will try as best I can reply to your questions, the ones that I can remember, and try to string them together. Let's see, the question of how did it happen? How did we arrive at a moment where, that much of the world, although, Hamza and Baba made some really great contributions in terms of showing that much of the world is, in fact, reacting and fighting back and taking matters into their hands in terms of deciding what their political platform is. But the question was raised was important ones, like how is it that much of the world is in essence seems to be, politically speaking, in the pocket of the bourgeoisie. And of course, it's a problem that's had worried and flummoxed leftists from a very long time. So it's one that goes generation to generation. So it's nice to arrive at that question. However, if we spent the last 20, 30, 40 years not addressing that front and center, that we've arrived at that moment in a much more concrete way means that maybe we're moving along well. But on the other hand, there is an aspect of a kind of that is the ideological program of capitalism. It's not merely a matter of movement of material goods from one side of the world to the other. It's also there's the materialisms extend into sociality, into semiotics. It's a program by which people are in essence inculcated with the premises of the system, even those who are most exploited. And so that takes considerable amount of work to unplug people out of that. And, they've got, while we have the numbers, they have the money. And it's now a program by which, well, how do we unplug out of that? I think the question of whether or not socialism can be as productive as capitalism might have a tinge of that, if only of that premise, because socialist society would not be in the business of just pumping out commodities and GDP and all that. It would move to a different set of variables that would account for economic and population health. And clearly, any society would require to feed its people and take care of them. I was going to say in health and otherwise, although it seems that in this last round in COVID, there were many a country that didn't see that at all. I mean, that's the remarkable thing, the horrible thing. they have said, it's been said of Yale University that it's a mutual fund with a college attached to it, and Britain and the United States seem to indicate it's a stock market with a country attached to it. I mean, it was more important that the wealthy remain wealthy even through the outbreak, and that is a horrible thing. I think it was another question, like where is this going to? I mean, the bourgeoisie are shameless in their capacity to take all the damage they do and then use that as the very next basis of the next iteration of capital accumulation. I mean, there's no shame there. And I mean, there's no, the thing is many an academic mistakes the notion that if we just break down the argument, then that will be enough. We're going to point out the conflicts and contradictions in the capitalist market argument. They don't care about that. They're perfectly comfortable with rolling over the damage that they cause into the next round of things. And so it's our job, in essence, to undercut that, in essence, to try to move to working with the people on a day-to-day basis, and in essence, move toward connecting the ideas that we might have with the realities on the ground in which everyday people have to deal with. And it's better, it's easier said than done, of course, but unpacking what capitalists do is, of course, critical, but it's certainly only the first step toward moving us out of this terrible moment. I mean, there's no spatial fix to be done anymore. There's no, all this stuff, as horrible as it is already rolling over the worst of damage, as Hamza pointed out, onto people, externalizing all the costs of production in such a way that it just, leads the worst of it on those who have been victimized in the first place. So in terms of pandemics, yes, SARS-2 was probably, SARS-2, that's the virus that causes COVID-19, is probably only one of many to come. It's not going to be another 100 years for the next terrible outbreak to happen. I think some of the phylogenetic work, looking at genetics of the virus, indicates that, in fact, we've probably had SARS spillover at quite a pace. I mean, think about it. We've had 3 major ones in less than 20 years, in 18 years, right? SARS-1, MERS, SARS-2. And, and there have been multiple SARS that spilled over into humans that weren't as damaging. But I mean, we're operating at a frequency of spillover events that is going to be a terrible thing. And what the capitalists will do is to try to then use the danger that they themselves have brought about as the means by which to continue their control. They say, you need protection, you need us to do so. Even as here in the States, 12 million people were infected. They're going to use that as a reason why they should continue in power, which is extraordinary. And also, unfortunately, a marker of the kind of ideological victory in terms of the capacity to make millions, if not billions of people accept their premises. So that's the terrible news of things. On the other hand, it's important that we're very clear about the scale of things and what the program and project ahead involves. I am very much in favor of being optimistic about things, but optimism can also be used, unfortunately, as a placeholder, as a way of expecting some deus ex machina to come in and save the day, when in actuality, it's going to take us right now at this historical moment to do the work necessary to get out from underneath that. And, there are grave dangers that go along with that, because the bourgeoisie do not fuck around, if I may use the technical term. They are willing and able to be nice and chummy along the NGO lines. But as soon as any real resistance comes about, they're perfectly willing to bring the army in or allow a Trump to come in and move and act in that way until he fucks things up and needs to be removed. But Biden comes back in. It's just a return back to the neoliberalism that caused the Trump to emerge in the first place. And a second Trump, in all likely, a hell of a lot more competent to emerge here in the States, as we find elsewhere around the world. So I would say then that socialism isn't in the game to actually just reproduce capitalism and just with a few more needs taken care of. It has to be a foundational shift along the lines of the metabolic rifts that Hamza brought up, and Lin Chun, the notions of returning humanity back to Earth, as it were. The Earth that, frankly, we never left, but pretended we did. So we need to move toward things like degrowth. We need to move toward decolonization, developmental convergence between global North and South. We need to move to debt cancellation. We need to move to the disalienation of land and labor. These are foundational differences that are not anywhere really that an NGO can try to assimilate. And it's a foundational program that's completely different. And frankly, you know, in order to work, we'll have to engage in exactly the kind of international solidarity that's necessary to bring that about. As far as the, you know, the kind of regenerative agricultures that were brought up to address that side of things, you know, that involves the kind of disalienation of land and labor again. And of course, there are different types of regenerative agriculture. There's the kind of whitewash version here in the US and EU, which is basically, let's get the soil healthy. It's an important thing to do. It's not enough. You can't get the soil healthy if you've got Cargill and General Mills here in the Minnesota breathing down your neck and demanding that you, in essence, continue to carbon mine your landscape to ruin. But those companies are perfectly willing and able to put millions of dollars into that kind of regenerative agriculture as a next generation in greenwashing. So now we are in a position to have to, in essence, follow the lead of peasantry around the world by way of the Via Campesina, you know, in essence, you know, a different polarity in terms of where we look and draw meaning and understanding and, you know, leadership and ideas about moving forward, and unplug ourselves out of the bourgeois TV show that goes on for every country, everywhere, all the time, nonstop, in which it, in essence, crowds out people's notion that they too have a right to take control and participate in their community life and make decisions and return the kind of locus of control to community and regional levels that can, in terms of the mutual aid part, also be supported by the state. So we can have, and this is what's happened with COVID, those countries that were able to succeed in blocking COVID in 2 months' time, in essence, the states supported local community efforts to engage in the kind of community practices necessary to make sure that on lockdown, people are given the food and resources they need to survive and make our way through this kind of outbreak. So, you know, while capitalism sees this as an opportunity to reset the cycle of accumulation in their favor, I mean, to the point of H. Bruce Franklin's notion that Zizek stole, that they view the end of capitalism less likely than the end of the world. I mean, it's extraordinary. These people are sociopaths. You don't want to follow them. You got to look around you. You know, the friend you have at the bar who likes to talk a lot, that he has much more sense than Bojo does. So, you know, like, start moving toward working, looking to people around you and coming up with solutions along that way. And what am I getting at here? I think moving forward is just getting out of this is, I mean, it's ridiculous. It's a generational problem. The students on the call have been brilliant and wonderful. And in some sense, we owe you an apology because this has been placed on your lap. But, you know, this is the excitement of a time in which you can ask, you know, bring to bear your consciousness and understanding and your youth and energy and joy to help us, all of us, in an intergenerational way, in international solidarity, work together to get out of this fix. And, you know, despite we have to be really brass tacks about the dangers upcoming and the difficulties and frankly, the blood spilled in short order. I mean, there's no getting around it. They're not just going to hand it over to you. Then in addition, there is also the possibility of, you know, preserving life and limb on this planet, human and non-human. And, you know, the beautiful things about this place is that you get to walk on the surface of a planet without wearing a spacesuit. And it'd be really nice if we were able to continue to do that. which means we have to take the power out of the hands of the sociopaths who, no matter how well dressed they are or how able they're able to raise their pinky when they drink their tea, then they're still, however, completely out of their minds. And so now we're going to have to be in the business of looking to other peoples who have been demoted and crapped on for hundreds of years. That's the indigenous, that's the smallholders, that are peoples all around the world. And they are our brothers and sisters. And those are the people that we're going to start working with.
Lucia, can I add something quickly?
Yes, yes. We also have Baba, yeah?
Ah, yeah, I forgot. Okay, let Baba speak.
Yeah, so I want to, yes, let Baba speak and then I'll call you, sorry. Baba, do you want to come in briefly?
Yes, I will quite briefly. With regards to how can the movement in Nigeria be supported, I think there's the need for trade unions, socialists, organizations to speak out in defense of the right of protesters in the unfolding struggle, and not leave the narrative to members of parliament and so on and so forth. As I was saying earlier, there is debates within several organizers of the protest. Then yesterday, after the British Parliament took on the discussions in this light, and some pointed out that, well, we keep talking of support, solidarity from below. Even governments had to support the ANC. There were diplomatic maneuvers. But as we pointed out, the strength of support for the anti-apartheid movement was from trade unions, was from left groups. This put even as much, if not more, pressure than the ANC in exile on governments to take actions where they did. Interestingly, both the United States and the UK were against sanctions, then saying it will hurt the blacks more, as if that was when they started, really loving the blacks. So I think that's the most important thing. But quickly tying it to the issue, because of time, then I need to go into this. The issue of COVID and its impact on what is happening in Nigeria is interesting that after the protest was drowned in blood, there were tens of thousands on the streets, not just those that were attacking property, but those that moved into warehouses where foodstuffs that were meant as COVID-19 palliatives were kept by politicians to use for patronage subsequently. So things have been made worse with COVID, and the impact of this, the next rising might not even be just around police brutality. The COVID crisis is worsening what people are going through and getting anger more. And finally, when Lawrence Wong was speaking about the issue of vaccines showing collaboration globally, relating it to this theme of decolonization, it's important to stress that just a handful of countries have already made, advance demand for about 80% of this vaccine, leaving over 100 countries to scramble for barely 20 of it. This itself is an example of the power dynamics. It's an example of the new phase of dynamic of imperialism within the pandemic. And so I think we're duty bound to call for and support the cause for a people's vaccine. That is to say, a vaccine, that is available to everybody, irrespective of the country or the class, rather than something that would be mainly the preserve of the global north at this juncture.
Thank you so much, Baba. Well, Jolene asked the question for Lin Chun. I have copied it, and Joe, it's very long, so it's a bit late now. I will send it to Professor Lin Chun and after the meeting, maybe, because it's a very interesting question, but unfortunately we don't have time. Well, I want to thank everyone. This has been really an inspiring meeting, and I see from the comments that many others agree with me. It has been recorded, so we'll find a way of sharing the video with you. And before we finish, I think I will leave Hamza to conclude the meeting. So I want to thank also the other organizers, of course, Alex, Kalini Kosla, Ipi, Elisa Greco, and John Narayan, who helped with the organization. Okay, thanks everyone. Please,
Thanks,
thumbs up.
Thanks, Lucia.
Thank you very much, Lucia.
Thanks.
That was a great conversation. I just wanted to say something about the alternative, because always that question comes around, and it is a legitimate question. We need to find an answer to it. It's not just about what is the alternative, but how to build it. I think the first thing to do is to ask the right questions, to see through the deceptive language and ploys of the ruling classes in order to construct counter-hegemonic and anti-colonial, anti-patriarchal, anti-racist, and anti-capitalist discourses that will allow us to connect the different struggles. Because there are various struggles right now: climate justice, environmental justice, trade justice, anti-militarization, food sovereignty, because all these problems are linked to a system that accumulates through dispossession or through destruction. So the responses need to be systemic. And of course, this is a long-term struggle that necessitates revolutions. And as you know, always revolutions are followed by counter-revolutions and defeats, but then people rise again. So we should see it in a long-term, as a long-term, struggle. So yeah, let's decolonize and let's build. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, and see you soon. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.